Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well today. We're just going to jump right into things because, again, we're still a little bit behind of where I wanted to be, so I don't want to waste any more time. First thing we need to do is finish up talking about attributions, then we're going to move on to a new topic today. So if you recall, last class when I was talking about attributions, I was talking about how they are the theories that researchers have about how people explain other people's behavior. And if you recall, one of the one of the key aspects of attributions is that we as researchers want to know when people will make an internal versus an external attribution. So if you recall, that means internal means explaining someone's behavior by pointing to their personality. So they did something because they're a nice person, they're a rude person, they're whatever, by pointing to a personality characteristic. Whereas an external attribution occurs when we explain someone else's behavior by pointing to something in the environment or the situation. Something in the situation led them to behave the way that they did. And I had just introduced the concept of the overjustification effect last class. So just to refresh your memory, the overjustification effect occurs when we make attributions for our own behavior. And in particular, what the overjustification effect states is that when you have an activity you intrinsically enjoy doing, whether it's playing a sport or painting or dancing or singing or whatever hobby that it is that you have, something that you intrinsically like doing, if you start to get paid to do that thing, you start enjoying it less. Your intrinsic motivation diminishes. And I'm going to walk you through a study that looks at this. I'm going to explain why this happens in terms of this attributional process that we make for ourselves. So the study I want to talk about is a relatively famous one where researchers looked at children's attitudes towards playing with markers. So what some researchers did is they went into a classroom on 3 different days. Okay, here's what happened on each day. So on day 1, they went into this classroom and they simply had a bunch of markers there, and they allowed the kids to play with the markers for as long as they wanted to. And for most kids, that's a somewhat enjoyable activity, so they spend a certain amount of time playing with the markers. Now, the researchers did this just to establish that the kids intrinsically enjoyed playing with the markers on day 1. On day 2, the researchers come back, and at this point, they randomly assign the kids to one of 3 conditions. So in one condition, in the control condition, they again allow the kids to play with markers, just like they did on day 1. In the other 2 conditions, the kids receive a reward. So in one condition, the expected reward condition, the researchers come in and they lay out the markers and they tell the kids that if they play with the markers, then at the end of the day, they're going to get a reward. Specifically, it was a blue ribbon and a good player certificate. So the kids knew, in other words, that if they play with the markers, they would get this reward. In the third condition, we're going to call this the unexpected reward condition. The kids were allowed to play with the markers, but they weren't told anything about a reward. Then at the end of the day, they got a surprise reward if they had played with the markers. Okay, so there's a control condition who got no reward, a group of kids who got an expected reward for playing with the markers, and a group of kids who got an unexpected, a surprise reward for playing with the markers. And the researchers leave and they come back on day 3. And on day 3, it's just like day 1. They lay out the markers and they say, here are the markers. If you want to play with them, feel free to play with them as much as you want. But critically, at this point, no kids are given any rewards on day 3. All right, now what the researchers want to know is they're basically testing the overjustification effect. What they want to know is whether being rewarded on day 2 for playing with the markers, getting this extrinsic motivation, would undermine the kids' intrinsic motivation. In other words, would the kids who got a reward on day 2, would they suddenly not care about playing with the markers on day 3? So what we're going to look at on the following slide is a graph that shows you the percentage of time that the kids spent playing with the markers on day 3, which is basically a measure of how much they intrinsically enjoy playing with the markers. And we're going to start, and this is as a function of the condition that they were randomly assigned to on day 2, the one of the 3 conditions that I mentioned. And we're going to start by looking at the right side of the graph, and we're going to work our way to the left. Okay, so on the right side of the graph are the kids who got no reward. Now what you can see, so remember that the higher the bars are, the more intrinsically enjoying or the more the kids intrinsically enjoyed playing with the markers. So as you can see in the no reward condition, the kids who did not get a reward on day 2, they still liked playing with markers on day 3. Their intrinsic motivation had not diminished. If we look at the kids who got an unexpected reward on day 2, they also still liked playing with the markers on day 3. You can see that they spent about the same amount of time as the kids in the control group did. So they also had intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. But the critical condition is this expected reward condition. So the kids who knew on day 2, at the beginning of day 2, that they would get rewarded at the end of day 2 if they played with the markers. So they received that extrinsic reward. Suddenly on day 3, they don't want to play with the markers anymore. Right? In other words, their intrinsic motivation for playing with the markers, their enjoyment, their intrinsic inherent enjoyment of playing with the markers has diminished on day 3. Now the question is, of course, why did this occur? Why did they lose that intrinsic motivation? Well, the way to think about this is that you have to put yourself in the mindset of these kids on day 3. Okay, so on day 3, they're allowed to play with the markers. They don't have to, but they're allowed to. And so the kids are effectively asking themselves, how much do I like playing with markers? If I like playing with them, I'll play with them a lot. If I don't like playing with them, I'm not going to play with them, right? So how much do I like playing with them? Well, the kids who had never been rewarded on day 2, they can think back and they can say, well, the prior 2 days I played with the markers and I never got anything out of it. I must really like playing with the markers, right? So they play with the markers on day 3. The children in the unexpected reward condition, so on day 2 in the unexpected reward condition, on day 3, when they're thinking, do I like playing with the markers? Well, yesterday on day 2, I played with the markers and I got a reward for it, but I didn't know I was going to get a reward for it. It was a surprise. And so that's not why I played with the markers. So clearly on day 2, I played with the markers because I really liked it. I must really like playing with markers. So they play with the markers on day 3. But critically, what happens is that the kids who had received an expected reward on day 2, when they're thinking on day 3, do I like playing with the markers? Well, yesterday on day 2, I played with the markers, but I got a reward for it. And I knew I was going to get a reward for it. It was expected. I was told that if I play with markers, I was going to get a reward. And so, yeah, I played with markers on day 2, but I only did it for the external reward. I only did it to get the blue ribbon and the good player certificate. Therefore, I must not really like playing with markers very much. As a consequence, they stopped playing with the markers on day 3. In order to understand what's happening here, you have to think like a self-perception theorist. So we saw self-perception theory before, right? This is the idea that we learn about ourselves by observing our own past behavior or thinking about our own past behavior. And that's what these kids are doing. They're thinking that yesterday I played with the markers and I got an expected reward for it. So therefore I must have only done it because of the reward. And therefore I don't like doing it. I don't like playing with the markers that much. Okay, so the basic idea here is that what initially started off as fun, these kids start misattributing the reason for why they're engaging in that behavior. They're attributing their behavior, I played with the markers on day 2, they're mistakenly attributing that to the fact that they got this extrinsic reward. As a consequence, what seemed like fun at first starts to feel more like work. I mean, think about this. I guess if you were painting for fun, for instance, and then that becomes your job and you earn a lot of money selling your paintings, and then all of a sudden you no longer receive any money for painting. You might start thinking to yourself, well, wait a second, I was receiving money for painting before. Now I'm not. I mean, why would I paint if I'm not going to be receiving money? And so you stop painting as much, right? What's happened again is that you've misattributed the reason for why you painted in the first place. In reality, it was because you really liked it, but you're thinking it's because you were given the reward for it. And therefore, when that reward is taken away, you don't want to paint anymore. Okay, so what's happening here is a misattribution, right? People are misattributing the reason for why they engage in that behavior. There's a story, I think it's in your textbook actually, that highlights the overjustification effect. Okay, so imagine that there is a man who has a shop, and this shop has a whole bunch of really large glass windows in the front. And he had a problem because what would happen is that these kids would keep coming to his shop and throwing rocks through his windows, and it would cost him a lot of money to fix them. So he had to figure out a way to get these kids to stop throwing rocks through his windows. And I think most people would think of, well, go and yell at the kids and make sure they don't come back, right? But he was clever and he used some social psychology. So what he did is the next time he saw the kids throwing rocks through his windows, he ran out to them and he said, hey, look, I'm not going to yell at you. In fact, I actually like what you're doing. In fact, I like it so much that if you come back tomorrow and throw rocks through my windows, I'll pay each of you a quarter. So the kids leave and they think, well, we're going to throw rocks through his window anyway, so we might as well get paid for it. So they come back the next day, they throw rocks through his windows, and he comes out and he says, thank you so much for doing this. Here's a quarter for each of you. And I tell you what, I want you to come back tomorrow and throw rocks through my windows again. I don't have as much money, so I can only pay you a dime. Okay, but if you do that, I'll pay you a dime. And so the kids leave and they come back the next day and they throw rocks through his windows, and a man runs out there and he pays each of the kids a dime. He says, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so glad you're throwing rocks through my windows. I want you to do it again tomorrow, but I'm all out of money. So I want you to throw rocks through my windows tomorrow, but I can't pay you. And the kids look at him and say, well, if you're not going to pay us, then why would we throw rocks through your windows? And they leave and never come back. So what's happened here is he's used the over-justification effect to his advantage, right? These kids who initially intrinsically enjoyed throwing rocks through his windows started to get paid for it, started to feel like work in a sense, right? And when they started to get paid for it, they started to think they were only doing it for the money. And so therefore, when the money was later taken away, the kids start thinking, well, why would I do this if I'm not getting paid for it? They mistakenly attributed the reason for why they threw rocks through his windows to the fact that they were getting this extrinsic reward and not to the fact that they intrinsically enjoyed it. The over-justification effect has a lot of implications, especially if you're a parent. So imagine that you want your kids to get good grades in schools, right? And so one strategy that some parents might have to try to get their kids to get good grades in schools is if you bring home a report card and it has all A's, then I'll take you out for ice cream or you get some sort of reward for it, right? And that's well-intentioned, but it has this negative side effect. Because what's going to start happening is that if these kids get ice cream every time they bring home a report card with all A's, they're going to start to think that the only reason they're getting good grades is because they get ice cream. But at some point, they're going to grow up. Maybe they go away to college or something, and they don't get rewarded anymore for good grades. And now they're going to start thinking, well, if the only reason I was getting good grades is to get ice cream, and I'm no longer getting ice cream, why would I try to get good grades? So what the parents of these kids might have accidentally done is they might have accidentally undermined the kids' inherent intrinsic motivation to do well in school. Okay, this is the problem with giving these external reinforcers, or in other words, by giving people a reward or money or some reward of some sort. By giving them that reward, it changes the motivation of that person to engage in that behavior. I saw this as well when I was young. When I was a little kid, I used to play soccer in like little community soccer leagues. And some of the coaches of other teams, it was never my team, but the other coaches would take their players out for ice cream if they won the game. Now, I was always jealous of that because my coach never did this, right? But they would take their kids out for ice cream if they won. Now, the idea behind this coach's behavior was to encourage the kids to play hard and things like that. But the problem is they didn't appreciate the over-justification effect. Because what's going to start happening is that the kids are going to start thinking that the only reason they're trying to win the game is because they get this external reward, because they get taken out for ice cream. And so maybe the next year, they're on a different team with a different coach who doesn't take them out for ice cream. And the kids start thinking, well, why would I try hard if I'm not going to go out for ice cream if I win? So what the coaches might have accidentally done is to undermine the kids' intrinsic motivation to play soccer. So what should you do if you're a parent, for instance, then what should you do to avoid the over-justification effect? Well, remember that on the prior slide, the slide here, remember that the kids who got an unexpected reward, a surprise reward, their intrinsic motivation was not undermined because they knew, like they realized that yesterday I got a reward, but I didn't know I was getting it. And so that can't explain why I played with the markers. Well, in the same way, if kids get an unexpected reward, let's say if they do well in school, that doesn't undermine their intrinsic motivation. Now, obviously, if you're a parent and you give these unexpected rewards every time the kid brings home a good report card, the kid's going to start to expect it, right? So it truly has to be unexpected to avoid undermining people's intrinsic motivation. Okay, so that is why the over-justification effect is an attributional bias. The ways that we make attributions for our own behavior get biased effectively. Okay, so before I move on, I'll take any questions if anyone has any, either on the over-justification effect or any other attributional phenomena that we've talked about. So remember, we talked about the fundamental attribution error. We talked about the actor-observer effect. We talked about Kelly's attribution theory. If anyone has any questions on any of those things, I'll gladly take them now, if you want to write them in the chat. And while I wait to see if anyone has any questions, we're going to go into Top Hat and take a quiz. So open up your Top Hat account. Is it only external rewards that can cause this? I'm not sure what an internal reward would be per se, but generally, unless it's like a feeling of accomplishment or something like that, yeah, it's external rewards that are responsible for this. If you just feel good because you've accomplished something, which I guess you might consider an intrinsic or an internal reward, that's not going to undermine your intrinsic motivation. If anything, you're going to realize that you really liked doing this activity and you got rewarded. It's just going to strengthen the idea that you're intrinsically motivated to perform that activity. When you say, does it affect adulthood? I'm assuming what you mean is, does the over-justification effect occur among adults? And yeah, that's a good point, because all the examples I gave were of children, right? So yes, it can affect adults in the exact same way that it affects children, yeah. Okay, so let's open Top Hat if there are no more questions. Oh, actually, sorry, I forgot. I will just sum up on this slide here. I forgot that I had this last slide. Just to sum up everything then, this tendency to make attributions for other people's behavior is natural and common. We all want to do it. We don't really like seeing behavior and not having an idea of why someone engaged in that behavior. We always want to attribute it to some cause or some source. It's a very, very natural process. We all do this constantly. The key idea here in this attribution section is that sometimes people can be very rational. They can come to very rational conclusions about why someone did something. And so when we looked at Kelly's attribution theory, we saw that people can be rational. So remember that people, according to Kelly, in order to come up to an attribution, people ask themselves 3 questions: a consensus question, a distinctiveness question, and a consistency question. And depending on the responses they get to those questions, that leads them to make a very rational, logical attribution for other people's behavior. It's a very rational idea. However, we don't always do this. People oftentimes make biased attributions as well. And so we saw that with respect to the fundamental attribution error, which, just to refresh your memory, is the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their disposition, to their personality, and to over-attribute it to their personality. The actor-observer effect, remember, that refers to the tendency that while we attribute other people's behavior to their disposition, we attribute our own behavior to the situation. So we're sort of, it's kind of like we're a little bit hypocritical in that sense. The exact same behavior we might explain in terms of the situation for ourselves, but in terms of someone's personality for someone else. And as we just saw, the over-justification effect, this attributional bias, where our intrinsic motivation for some activity gets undermined by an extrinsic reward. And these are all good examples of attributional biases. Okay, so now let's go into Top Hat. There's 5 questions here, as usual. The first one is from the first part of social cognition, when we talked about some of the biases and heuristics. So question 1. People tend to use the availability heuristic, which states that people tend to judge the likelihood of an event based on which of the following: A, how much that event resembles a typical event; B, how easily instances of the event come to mind; C, our prior opinions of and experiences with the event; or D, an illusory correlation. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so according to the availability heuristic, we judge how frequently something occurs based on how easily we can imagine examples of that thing happening, or in other words, how easily instances of the event come to mind, which makes B the correct answer. Okay, here's some attribution questions. So imagine that Mike and Maria are dating. When Mike gets angry with Maria, Maria attributes it to Mike being a naturally angry person. But when Maria gets angry with Mike, she attributes it to having had a bad day at work. Maria is exhibiting which of the following biases? Fundamental attribution error, confirmation bias, the actor-observer effect, or the overjustification effect? We got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so people almost always choose between one of two options here. Most people choose between A and C. Yep, that's what I thought. Okay, so the correct answer is actually C, the actor-observer effect. So it looks like a lot of people got this one wrong. Okay, so remember, the difference is this. Okay, this is what you need to remember. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to over-attribute someone else's behavior to their personality, to their disposition. That's it. It has nothing to do with how you attribute your own behavior. The actor-observer effect is the fact that we attribute other people's behavior to their disposition, but our own behavior to the situation. And that's what's happening here, right? Maria's attributing Mike's behavior to his disposition, but her own same behavior to the situation, having had a bad day at work. As a consequence, this is the actor-observer effect. Question 3. You watch a commercial of LeBron James endorsing a new basketball sneaker. Although you know that James was paid to endorse the sneakers and didn't even write the endorsement himself, you still think that James really likes the new sneakers. This illustrates which of the following? Confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, actor-observer effect, or overjustification effect? Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so here we have a situation where we're making an attribution for why is LeBron James endorsing this basketball sneaker. And even though we know there's a lot of situational constraints that would lead to that behavior, he's getting paid to do it, right? That means the situation is dictating his behavior. We still tend to attribute his behavior to dispositional or personal causes. We say that it's because he really likes the sneakers. That is basically almost the definition of B, the fundamental attribution error. Ooh, okay, people are all over the place. Okay, so I think you guys really need to study up on attributions before the exam, okay? Or maybe I just need to lecture better. Because I think people are getting a little bit confused between the different biases. So just make sure that you're studying this up for the exam. Oh, by the way, if I just go back for a second, just to answer the question of why is this not the confirmation bias, confirmation bias means I have a pre-existing belief and I interpret information in light of that pre-existing belief. In this case here, I didn't mention anything about a pre-existing belief. Now, if you went into the situation thinking LeBron James really loves this type of basketball sneaker, then maybe you can make an argument that this is confirmation bias. You're interpreting information in light of those pre-existing beliefs. But there's no talk of any pre-existing beliefs here, and that's why this is not the confirmation bias. Okay. The answer to this was the fundamental attribution error. Yeah, a lot of these biases, by the way, are kind of similar, and they're all related in various ways. So it's really important to understand the differences between them. According to the overjustification effect, people will tend to lose intrinsic motivation for a behavior if they do which of the following? If they start to get paid for the behavior, if they receive a surprise gift for the behavior, if they stop getting paid for the behavior, or if they see someone else receive a surprise gift for the behavior. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so this is another question where people tend to give one of two answers. People tend to say either A or C. This one's actually a little bit tricky, but good. A is the correct answer. If they start to get paid for the behavior. So it's important to note that as soon as someone starts to get paid for a behavior, they start to lose their intrinsic motivation, which is why A is correct. That being said, as long as they keep getting paid for the behavior, they'll still maintain that behavior because they're getting paid for it. You only see it. You only see that you've undermined their intrinsic motivation when you stop paying them for the behavior, because that's when their behavior drops off, because they figure, why would I engage in this behavior if I'm not getting paid for it anymore? But they start to lose intrinsic motivation as soon as they start to get paid for the behavior, which is option A. Okay, this is a general question of everything we've discussed in the semester. So which of the following is not a general theme that can be extracted from findings we've discussed in social psychology so far? So 3 of these are themes we've discussed, one of them is not. A, people's fundamental motivation is to obtain accurate information about themselves and others. B, people are often not aware of the causes of their behaviors or decisions. C, people do not like to think very much and will often use mental shortcuts to reach various decisions. Or D, people are highly motivated to see themselves in a positive light, which is not a fundamental theme. Okay, 10 seconds. Three, two, one. Okay, so I've been trying to talk about these themes as we've been going through the semester. And so far, we've seen that, for instance, that people are highly motivated to see themselves in a positive light. We saw that when we look at the self, and we engage in a lot of biases as a consequence. We've seen that people do not like to think very much and will often use mental shortcuts. We saw that that's one of the reasons people rely on things like heuristics, for instance. And we've also seen B, that people are often not aware of the causes of their behaviors. So we saw that when we looked at introspection as well, that we often are not aware of why we prefer one thing over the other. That's why option A is the correct answer, in that it is not a theme. And I've talked about this at some length. So we can, under some circumstances, be motivated to obtain accurate information about ourselves. If you really want to improve yourself, then you want to know what your skills are like accurately. But under most situations, we're not really motivated because we want to think really highly of ourselves. We want to feel good about ourselves, so we're motivated to find self-enhancing information. That's why A is the correct answer there. Okay, so we are starting a new topic. In particular, we're going to start talking about attitudes. And the idea or the concept of looking at attitudes is one of the most important questions that has faced social psychology historically. And part of the reason for that is because one of the primary goals of social psychology is to be able to predict people's behavior. And one of the best ways we have of predicting people's behavior is knowing their attitudes. So for instance, if I want to predict if you're going to buy Coke or Pepsi when you go to the grocery store next time, then one way to do that is to know what is your attitude towards Coke and what's your attitude towards Pepsi. If you have a very strong preference for Coke versus Pepsi, then I can predict probably accurately you're going to buy Coke when you go to the store. And so similarly, if we want to predict any behavior, then it makes sense that we want to know what people's attitudes are to see if that predicts their behavior. That's why it's one of the most fundamental important concepts in social psychology. But we're going to see that things are a little trickier than they first appear when we start looking at attitudes. I think pretty much everyone knows what we mean when we talk about attitudes. There have been dozens and dozens of definitions that social psychologists have used to define what an attitude is. Here's one of the more popular ones, is that it's a predisposition to respond favorably or unfavorably to some object or idea. And there's a couple of aspects of this definition that are important. First off is that it's valenced, meaning we like things or we don't like things, right? That's what this means, that we respond favorably or unfavorably, right? Second key point to make here is that an attitude is not limited to just how you feel about something. That's sometimes how we refer to attitudes in our day-to-day life, just how we feel about something. But a social psychologist has a somewhat broader perspective of attitudes. And I'm going to go into more detail on this on the next slide, is that it's not just how we feel about something, but it's also how we behave towards things. So if you have a positive attitude towards, let's say, Coke versus Pepsi, you might like it better. And it also means you engage in different behaviors towards Coke than you do towards Pepsi. In other words, you're more likely to buy Coke and drink Coke than you are Pepsi. Now, social psychologists make a distinction between what's called explicit attitudes on the one hand, and on the other hand, what are called implicit attitudes. We are going to focus on explicit attitudes. And these are the attitudes you're familiar with having. They're the attitudes you're aware of having. If you have a preference for Coke or Pepsi, that attitude is explicit. You're aware that you have that preference. An implicit attitude, on the other hand, is an attitude that we have that we're not even aware of having. In other words, we can be predisposed to respond favorably or unfavorably to something without us even being aware that we have that predisposition. And under those conditions, we say that the attitude is implicit. We're not going to focus on that right now. Later on in the course, especially when we get to stereotyping and prejudice, we're going to focus on a little bit more on implicit attitudes. But for now, let's just focus on explicit attitudes, the attitudes you're aware of having. Now, remember that when we talked about the self, we talked about the tripartite model of the self. And that was, we divided the self into the affective, behavioral, and cognitive components. And we're going to do something similar with attitudes as well. This is called the tripartite structure of attitudes. Don't worry about that term. You don't need to know that for anything. But here's the basic idea. So just like the ABCs, right? We saw that with the self, we're going to have the same ABCs for attitudes. So if you think about an attitude, social psychologists believe that attitudes are composed of three components. The first is the affective component. That is how you feel about something. So if you prefer Coke to Pepsi, then the affective component is the fact that you like drinking Coke and you don't like drinking Pepsi, let's say. It's like the emotional reaction. This is the part of the attitudes that we're used to thinking about. The B stands for the behavioral component of attitudes. So this is what I was alluding to a minute ago, where not only do we feel differently about Coke versus Pepsi, say, but we act differently towards those things as well. So you're more likely to drink Coke than you are to drink Pepsi if you have a positive attitude towards Coke. And the C, just like before, stands for the cognitive component. So the cognitive component of an attitude refers to all the thoughts and the beliefs that you have about the object that we're talking about. So if you prefer Coke over Pepsi, then the cognitive component refers to all the beliefs you have about why you think Coke is better than Pepsi. So maybe you think it is sweeter or less sweet, or it's more caffeinated, or whatever it is. Whatever your beliefs are about why you have that attitude, that's the cognitive component. Now, there has been some debate about whether all three of these components are actually necessary. We're going to come back to that point in just one second. But let me give you another example. So let's imagine that you're talking about a romantic partner. Okay? Now, hopefully you have a positive attitude towards your romantic partner. And so we can think about that attitude as being composed of those three components. So the affective component of that attitude means that you like being around your partner. You feel good. You have a positive emotional response about being around your partner. The behavioral component of that attitude would be, well, you spend a lot of time with that person. We spend more time with people that we like than people that we don't, for the most part, right? So there's a behavioral component to that attitude as well. And the cognitive components of that attitude would be, well, you believe that they're warm and caring and funny, and whatever positive characteristics they have that you believe is responsible for that positive attitude, that would form the cognitive component of that attitude. Now, remember, when we looked at introspection, we may not be accurate about the cognitive component. We've seen that people believe that they have certain reasons for why they like something, and those beliefs are not always accurate, right? That doesn't really matter for our purposes now. What matters now is that we have those beliefs, whether they're accurate or inaccurate. Those beliefs exist. So as I mentioned, some social psychologists believe that all three of these components are an inherent part of every attitude that we have. Some other ones disagree, though, and they would say that not all of these components are necessary for an attitude. And I want to give you an example, or a couple examples of what I mean by this. So in doing so, I'm going to give you a hypothetical example on the next couple slides. You don't have to copy this down or anything. I just want you to think about this, okay? Just think about your reaction to this hypothetical scenario. So imagine this. Imagine that Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They are traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach, and they decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. So my question to you, and feel free to respond in the chat, is what do you think about this? What do you think about Julie and Mark, brother and sister, sleeping together? Is it okay, or is it not okay? So I'm looking for answers in the chat here. What are your opinions on this? Okay, got a couple not okays. No, no, no. Oh, one person says maybe it's okay. Okay, most people say it's not okay. So to the people who said it's not okay, why not? What's wrong with it? Because they're related, but that just begs the question. So what's the problem with sleeping with someone you're related to? What's wrong with the fact that they're family? I mean, why is it a problem to sleep with someone in your family? Okay, so it's family. You'll have genetic issues with your offspring. Okay, so yeah, so that could be true. If they have a baby, that baby's at higher risk of developing abnormalities. So, but it's a good thing that Julie's on birth control, Mark uses a condom, so don't even worry about that. They're not going to have a child. So, given that they're not going to have a child, they don't have to worry about this genetic problems. If that's the reason why it's wrong, and that reason doesn't exist, then you're okay with it, then, right? It's socially unacceptable. Yeah, it's socially unacceptable, but that's okay. They're keeping that night as a special secret. So no one's ever going to find out about it. So you don't have to worry about it being socially unacceptable. And people say, okay, it's morally wrong. But why is it morally wrong? Is anyone hurt by this? I mean, if no one gets hurt, then how can it be morally wrong? So what do you think? Yeah, I mean, okay, so it could be an unhealthy relationship, right? But fortunately, it brings them even closer to each other. So it actually strengthened their bond. So you don't have to worry about that either. So it's not going to create an unhealthy relationship here. Okay, so it could eventually affect them with future relationships, but that could be true for a lot of people, but not for them. They're happy with what happened. Um, they're not going to do it again, so you don't have to worry about anything ongoing. There is a one-time deal, then they're going to go back to having regular relationships. So given all these things, given that and people go back to the society argument, but again, no one in society is going to know about this. This is a secret between the two of them. No one will ever know in society, right? And so we don't have to worry about societal issues here. Yeah, so maybe it affect their sibling relationship, but it doesn't. It makes it feel closer to each other, right? So there's no harm in that relationship. And so the idea here is that you guys are giving me a lot of reasons why you feel like this could be wrong, right? And I agree that in many, many situations, maybe most situations, the reasons you're coming up with would be applicable. But in this specific situation, pretty much none of those reasons apply to the situation, right? They're not going to have a child, so you don't have to worry about genetic abnormalities in babies. You don't have to worry about society because no one's ever going to know about it but them. You don't have to worry that it's going to harm their relationships because it brings them even closer. Okay. Um, and you guys are just like most people right now. Most people, when they read this scenario, feel, oh, that is really, really wrong. And then they try to come up with reasons for why it's wrong. And within this specific scenario, those reasons don't really apply. But if those were the true reasons why this situation is wrong, then you should feel okay with this situation because those reasons don't apply anymore, right? And yet, if you're like most people, you still feel like it's wrong, right? What that means or what that suggests is that you can have a negative emotional reaction to something, a negative affective attitude, the affective component of the attitude, that negative emotional reaction, without having the cognitive reasons for why you feel that way. Okay? And I'll give you another example here. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. So, what do you think about that? Was it okay for them to eat the dog? Okay, got a few more people saying no. Okay, and again, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you're saying no, why not? Why is that wrong? It was their dog, but they didn't kill it for food, right? It just happened to die. And so, if anything, they're just making sure nothing goes to waste. Okay, maybe it was family. They grew up with the dog, right? But so what? Farmers grow up with cows and they slaughter the cows, and you probably still eat hamburger, right? Yeah, and you may not have the heart to do that. That's true, but they're okay with it. So was it okay for them to eat the dog? Yeah, so it could be considered wrong in our society. But again, why would it be considered wrong in society? That just pushes the question back. Maybe it shouldn't be looked thought of as being wrong in society, right? Okay, wouldn't it psychologically mess with the kids? Okay, so let's imagine there were no kids. It was just a couple, an adult couple. So there were no kids to worry about. Are you okay with it yet? And again, the reason that I'm giving you these hypotheticals here is because these are examples of hypotheticals that people have been given in research studies, and and their reactions are just like yours. Almost universally, people are very disgusted by this, right? Or they feel like it's wrong. And yet again, we see a specific situation where it's hard to come up with reasons why it's wrong. You could say, well, maybe the dog has pathogens, they're going to get sick. But as long as they cook it properly, that shouldn't be too much of an issue, as long as it hasn't been dead for too long, right? Or they say, well, you don't want people killing their own pets. Well, they didn't kill their own pet; it was killed just by a car or something. So you don't have to worry about them killing the pet. Or you might say, well, it might be psychologically damaging for kids. But let's imagine there are no kids in this scenario, right? So what this is demonstrating yet again is that people can have an effective reaction to something like you guys are obviously having without really having cognitive justification for it. In fact, I would argue that many of the moral beliefs that we have are just like this, where we develop an automatic moral belief. And only once we have that belief do we then look for justifications to have that belief. We think it's often the opposite. We think that we develop these justifications which lead us to a moral belief. I think it's actually the opposite a lot of the time. We have a natural tendency to think things are right or wrong, and only then do we try to justify it with these cognitive reasons. And what these examples show is that we can still have these negative feelings without having the cognitive reasons why. Okay, so attitudes can be a little bit complex for that reason, right? Um, One obvious question, if we're going to be studying attitudes as social psychologists, is how is it that we measure attitudes? And there have been a number of ways that we do this. The most common way is simply by self-reports. In other words, we simply ask people. Usually you can give them a scale from like 1 to 7, from like strongly dislike to strongly like, or something along those lines, and have people report their attitudes by circling one of the numbers from 1 to 7. That's the easiest way and the most common way that psychologists measure attitudes. There are some limitations to this methodology. Now, as long as you're measuring explicit attitudes, that's probably okay. But we've seen before that there are problems with introspection, that people have problems understanding like the true reasons behind their attitudes, or especially if we're talking about something like implicit attitudes. You can't simply ask people their implicit attitudes because by definition, they don't know they have those implicit attitudes. So it's the most common way still of measuring attitudes, but there are some limitations to it. Other researchers have tried to get around some of these limitations by using other methods of measuring attitudes. So some researchers have looked at physiological responses that people may have, so how their body reacts. So you can show people slides of objects or events and measure some sort of physiological reaction that's happening in their body. So a couple of ways of doing this is with the use of an electroencephalogram, which is basically just measuring brain activity. And certain patterns of brain activity might be associated with certain attitudes. Or you can measure, or you can use an electromyograph, which is basically measuring your muscles in your face. You can put like these little sensors on your face. And if you're shown like a really disgusting image, for instance, like if you're shown a gory image of a car accident where someone died, your face will naturally contort into this like face of disgust, and that can be picked up by this electromyograph. So it can kind of link reactions to attitudes. A really common measure is something called a galvanic skin response. And that's basically, you put these electrodes on your skin and you pass this really weak electric current between them. And what happens is that if you're panicking or something, you know how you just like feel like cold, like get these cold sweats. That changes the way that electricity is conducted between the sensors, and so you can pick up when people are having extreme emotional reactions by using the galvanic skin response. And although all these measures can sort of, to some extent, get at attitudes, they're really kind of broad measures. They're not really able to differentiate between finer gradations of emotional responses. So maybe they might be able to tell you if people are feeling good or bad about something, but they can't really differentiate more than that. A third way that people have developed to measure attitudes is with the use of covert measures. The most common one of these is something called the implicit association test, or the IAT for short. I am not going to get into the IAT right now because later on in the course, I'm going to have you guys take an IAT so you can actually see how it works. But we're going to come back to that a little later in the course. So a natural question we might have about attitudes is, how do attitudes form in the first place? How do we develop the attitudes that we have? And I want to briefly mention a couple ways that we have of developing attitudes. And the first is through a learning process. And there's a number of learning processes that we might use in order to develop an attitude. You might be familiar with some of these from an introduction to psychology class or a behavior analysis class or something along those lines. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but just in case you're not, I'll just briefly go over it. So we might develop attitudes through a process known as classical conditioning. Okay, now to explain classical conditioning, I'm going to talk a little bit about little Albert, who you might have come across in like a developmental psych class or something. So I'm sure a lot of you know little Albert. This is little Albert here. Little Albert's a baby, and what the researcher, John Watson, wanted to know is whether he could create a negative attitude in little Albert towards, towards a rat. Now, you see there's a bunny on his lap. I'm going to get to that in 1 second. But so what he did first off is he would take this white rat and place it in front of little Albert. And little Albert's natural reaction was to reach out for the rat and like pet it and things like that. Okay, he kind of liked the rat, in other words. Then what the researcher did, which is kind of evil, it feels like in retrospect. But what he did is that every time little Albert would reach for the rat, he had this metal hammer and a metal bar and he would hit the bar with the hammer right behind little Albert's head. It would create this really loud noise, and little Albert would have this automatic startle reaction and he'd start crying, right? And so you can imagine every time little Albert reaches for the rat, this noise goes off and he starts crying. Well, it's not going to take too long before little Albert starts to associate the rat with those negative emotions. Right? So what's going to happen is that very shortly you can put a rat in front of little Albert and he'll immediately start crying even if that noise doesn't go off. In other words, little Albert has learned to associate the rat with these negative feelings. Okay, so in the definition of classical conditioning, that's what this is referring to. When two stimuli are repeatedly paired, that means like the rat and that really loud noise. An attitude for one stimulus, his attitude towards the rat, can result in the same attitude for the other stimulus. Or rather, I should say, the attitude for one stimulus, which is his negative reaction to the noise, can result in the same attitude for the other stimulus. He has a negative reaction to the rat as well. So he's learned to associate two things, right? The rat with the noise. So he has learned to develop a negative attitude towards rats. Furthermore, his negative attitude generalized to basically anything that was fuzzy or furry. So when the researchers put a rabbit in front of little Albert, like in this picture, he starts crying immediately, even though he's never had negative experiences with rabbits per se. But because he associated fuzzy things with this negative reaction, that's why he developed this negative reaction towards rabbits as well. So we can learn to develop attitudes towards things, in this case, rats or rabbits or whatever, if that thing has been paired with a negative reaction in our past. So that's one way that we can learn to form attitudes. There's a second learning process, something known as operant conditioning, by which we can also develop attitudes. Yeah, I should say, by the way, that little Albert, there is some controversy because from my understanding, once they created that negative attitude in him, they never took it away, from my understanding. So they had sort of created this phobia, this fear of fuzzy things that was left with him. I think that's what happened. I don't think they took it away. So there are some sort of ethical issues there. So you probably shouldn't do that, right? And we would not be able to do that today because we have these ethical review boards that our studies have to go through. But it was ethically questionable back then. Okay, so operant conditioning refers to a tendency where we can learn something, we can learn to develop a certain attitude if you're either rewarded or punished for that attitude. So, for instance, if let's imagine that every time you asked a question in this class, I gave you $1, right? You're rewarded for that behavior. You're rewarded for asking that question. Well, what's going to happen is people are going to ask questions all the time, right? And I'm just going to be giving money to everybody all the time. Your behavior has changed in response to that reward, and you might develop a more positive attitude towards asking questions. On the other hand, if every time you ask a question, I shocked you, well, it's pretty unpleasant to be shocked. And so as a consequence, you're going to learn very quickly to never ask questions. Okay, so obviously your behavior is going to change as a function of whether you are rewarded or punished for engaging in that behavior in the past. And so you can imagine if you've got a child, for instance, and every time that child, let's say it's a little boy, every time that boy hits his sister, if he's punished by his parents for doing so, then he's going to learn that he should not be hitting his sister. He might develop a more negative attitude towards violence. On the other hand, let's say his parents don't pay attention to this, and every time he hits his sister, he's able to steal her toy from her. He's basically been rewarded for using violence. And so he might develop a more positive attitude towards violence. So the attitudes we develop can in part be a function of whether we've been rewarded or punished for engaging in some behavior in the past. Okay, so those are two very common ways that we have of developing attitudes or of learning in general. A third type of learning, which is very, very simple, is something called observational learning. And according to observational learning, we can learn behaviors even if we're not rewarded or punished, or even if we don't associate it with any sort of negative outcome. We can learn simply by observing others. Okay? So for instance, if we observe our parents expressing certain attitudes as we're growing up, we may learn to develop a positive attitude towards those things as well. So for instance, you can imagine that if there are, and this is partly how sort of racism can carry through generations, is that if there are parents who are expressing racist attitudes, for instance, the child that's growing up in that household can learn that expressing racism is something that they should do simply by observing their parents do it themselves. So observational learning is something that's going to be important later on in the course, especially when we look at aggression. And we can see, in fact, someone mentioned it, the Van Doordaal experiment. That's right. So we're going to talk about that experiment later on in the course when we look at aggression. And that study basically looked at observational learning and whether children can learn to behave aggressively. So we're going to come back to this idea then. But we can form attitudes in other ways as well. Oh, and I see that someone messaged me a private message. Is it possible to change the psychological path of a psychopath or sociopath? That's beyond my pay grade. That's going to be abnormal psychology. Usually with social psychology, we deal with people who don't have those sorts of pathologies. If you're dealing with people who have those pathologies like sociopathy or something, that's going to be abnormal psychology. So that's beyond my area of expertise. So although I imagine that there might be ways to do that, I'm not sure. That's going to be better suited for an abnormal psychologist or a clinical psychologist. So another way that we can form attitudes is through a process of social comparison. So we saw social comparison before, where we learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves with similar other people, right? And I mentioned at the time that you can change what people think about themselves by changing their social environment. So you might have done really well in school and high school, and you think you're really good at some subject. Then you go to college, and suddenly the people around you are quite smart. And in comparison to them, maybe you don't feel as competent anymore. And so your attitude or your perception of yourself, of how good you are in that subject, can decrease, not because you've changed, but because your social environment has changed. And the same sort of process can occur that can lead us to develop attitudes as well. And to give you an example of this, I'll tell you about a famous study, the Bennington College study. This was a study that was conducted in the 1930s, I believe it is. Bennington College, at least at the time, was an all-girls school or all-women's school. And it was a private school, and so it cost money to go there. And this was in the years following the Great Depression of 1929. So there are a lot of people that didn't have money, right? And so what happens is that the only people that can afford to send their daughters there, the only families that can afford to send their daughters there, tended to be relatively well off, tend to be relatively rich. There's an association between having money and voting Republican. And so what that means is that the majority of the incoming freshmen of these women who attended Bennington College came from Republican families. And as a consequence, as they were growing up, due to processes of classical conditioning and operant conditioning and observational learning, they themselves had developed pro-Republican attitudes. And so what the researchers did is that there was an election coming up, and they looked at the percentage of people who voted for the Republican in that election, Alf Landon in this case. And what they saw is that among freshmen, the majority of freshmen voted for the Republican, which is consistent with this idea that most of these women came from families that were Republican in nature. But what the researcher was thinking here is that when these women got to Bennington College, the majority of people at Bennington College, the upperclassmen and the faculty and the staff, they tended to be much more democratic. And so what the researcher was wondering was, by changing someone's social environment from primarily Republican to primarily Democratic, would that also change these people's personal opinions? Would it change their own beliefs, their own attitudes towards politics, just by changing their social environment, consistent with the social comparison process? And so we looked at the percentage of these women who voted for the Republican as a function of what year they were in college. So among the freshmen, as I mentioned, the majority of them voted for the Republican. But if you look at the sophomores, that number drops off to only about 43% voted for the Republican. If you look at the juniors and seniors, that number really drops off to only about 15% of them. So what happened is that these women's attitudes towards politics changed simply by changing their social environment. And the researchers followed up with these women over the course of the next couple of decades. And the women who had changed to become Democrats, started off Republican at the beginning of college, became Democrats. They tended to remain Democratic for the rest of their lives. They tended to marry Democratic men as well. And so these were not short-term changes. These were long-term changes. Okay, so these women learned to develop, or I should say, these women developed different attitudes based on their social comparison group, the people that they were comparing themselves with. You change those people, you can change people's attitudes. Some attitudes are also related to genetics as well. Now, the details of this are much more complex than I can possibly get into in this class. I'm only going to sort of briefly gloss over this idea. It's not like we have genes. It's not like we have a specific code in our DNA that leads us to have specific attitudes. It's not like there's a Republican gene and a Democratic gene or anything like that. However, we do have genes that might lead us to be more or less willing to take risks, for instance. There might be some genetics behind that. And we know that the willingness to take risks is associated with your political preference. So people who are less willing to take risks are going to tend to be more conservative, and people who are more willing to take risks are going to tend to be more likely to be Democratic. And so what that means is that genetically speaking, if you inherit genes for being very cautious and not liking to take risks, then effectively that means that you are more likely to become conservative or Republican. Right? And we know that these sorts of attitudes that people have are at least partly genetic through what are known as twin studies. And you might have heard of twin studies in other classes. And they're a little bit more complex than I'm going to get into here. But the basic idea is that if you look at identical twins, so people who share their DNA, right? So an identical twin happens when a fertilized egg splits in two. So they're genetically identical, basically. And if you take identical twins who were separated at birth, so they grew up in totally different families, they've never met each other. If you take them and you give them each a questionnaire that assesses their attitudes on a number of topics, and then you correlate their answers, you compare them, what you find is that identical twins who are raised apart are more similar to each other than two random people in the population. And the question is, why is that the case? Why would identical twins be so similar to each other? They didn't grow up in the same environment. They didn't have the same family environment. They didn't go to the same school. They didn't live in the same city. So why are they so similar? And the only explanation we have is because they share the same genes. And so therefore, that would imply that many of the attitudes we have some sort of genetic component to them. Now, it's important to understand that this does not mean that our attitudes are written in stone from the moment that we're born. That's not what that means at all. Genetics are much, much more complicated than that. It just means that to some extent, some portions of our attitudes are influenced by the genetics that we have. Now, some of this is a little bit controversial for numerous reasons, again, that I'm not going to get into. So there is some amount of controversy. I think it's generally accepted that there is some degree of genetic factors that influence people's attitudes, but the magnitude of how much genetics matters is an argument that's been debated. Okay, but now let's get into sort of the meat, the main question that we want to address in this section. So at the beginning of the section, I mentioned that one of the reasons that researchers study attitudes is because they want to use people's attitudes to predict their future behaviors. And what that means is that the basic underlying assumption that researchers had was that attitudes influence behavior, right? Or another way of saying that is if you know someone's attitude, you can predict how they're going to behave. So attitudes predict behaviors. And this seems very self-explanatory, right? If you know people's attitudes towards Coke or Pepsi, that should allow you to predict what they're going to drink, Coke or Pepsi, right? It's a very basic assumption. This is why Gordon Allport, who's a famous social psychologist, said back in the 50s that the attitude is the most distinctive and important concept in contemporary American social psychology. If you know people's attitudes, you can predict their behaviors, and that's a fundamental goal of social psychologists. Okay, well, this seems easy enough then, right? If we want to know how people behave, then you should measure their behavior, or sorry, their attitudes related to that behavior, and that should allow you to predict their behavior. What could be simpler than that, right? But there was quickly a problem. Because in the 1960s, a guy by the name of Alan Wicker came along, and he reviewed a whole bunch of social psychology studies that looked at people's attitudes and looked at their behaviors. And he concluded the following: that there is little evidence to support the postulated existence of stable underlying attitudes within individuals, which influence both his or her verbal expressions and his or her actions. So there's really two components of what he's saying here. The first thing he's saying is that attitudes aren't related to behaviors, right? When he says attitudes which influence verbal expressions and actions, what he's saying is that there's no evidence that attitudes are even related to people's behaviors, which seems very counterintuitive. What he's basically saying is that if you know if someone likes Coke or Pepsi more, that doesn't allow you to predict if they drink Coke or Pepsi, which seems very counterintuitive, right? And in fact, he goes a step farther. And the second point that he makes here is that not only do attitudes not predict behaviors, but he can't even find evidence for the existence of attitudes in the first place. It's as if this concept that we have of what an attitude is, which is so ingrained in us and so seemingly obvious to us, doesn't even exist, or at least there's no evidence to show that it exists. This was a remarkable conclusion, right? And if Alan Wicker is correct, he's undermining one of the most important concepts in social psychology, right? The existence of attitudes. So partly for this reason, and partly for numerous other reasons, in the 1970s, social psychology went through what's called, or what they call the crisis of social psychology, in part because these very fundamental basic assumptions that researchers had didn't even have any substantial evidence to support them. This led to a flurry of research to try to figure out what is going on here. And so what I want to spend the rest of this lecture on is looking at the conditions under which attitudes do predict behaviors and attitudes don't predict behaviors. Because what the subsequent research showed is that although it's often true that attitudes and behaviors are completely unrelated, under the right conditions, they are related, and they can be strongly related. And so what we really need to do is to figure out, or to understand, what those conditions are under which attitudes are related to behaviors. But let me first give you an example of one of the studies that Alan Wicker came across, which seemed to show no relationship at all. This was a study done in 1936, I believe it was. The researcher, his last name was Lapierre. And what he did is he went around the US with a Chinese couple. And at the time in the US, there was widespread discrimination against the Chinese. And so what he did is he visited, I think it was 250 or so campgrounds and restaurants and hotels around the country as he went on this countrywide tour. Now, of the 250 places that he went to, only once were they refused service because they were with a Chinese couple. So despite the rampant discrimination, only once were they refused service. But when they got back from this tour, he mailed out these questionnaires to all of these places that he visited, all the campgrounds and all the hotels and restaurants. And he asked them if they would serve a Chinese person at their establishment. And more than 90% of these places said that they would not, that they would refuse service to a Chinese person. And yet we know that was not the case, right? So in other words, people's attitudes, which is that they did not want to serve a Chinese person at their establishments, did not correspond with their behaviors, which is that they actually did serve them over 99% of the time. So this seems to show a disjoint between people's attitudes and their behaviors. And similarly, there were a whole bunch of other studies that were very similar to this, that they measured people's attitudes. Like for instance, one study asked people, what is your attitude towards religion? And then they measured people's behavior. In that study, they measured whether those people went to church. And those studies showed no relationship, that you'd expect that people who have a more positive attitude towards religion would go to church more, and yet that's not what they found in these studies. So there are a whole bunch of studies showing that attitudes and behaviors didn't really match. So what's going on here? Well, subsequent research led researchers to understand that there were simply, as I mentioned, a series of conditions that had to hold in order for attitudes to predict behaviors. If these conditions don't hold, attitudes and behaviors are unrelated. And that's what happened in all these past studies. If these conditions do hold, then attitudes and behaviors are related to one another. So that's what we're going to start talking about next class, is what are those conditions that have to hold in order for attitudes to predict behaviors. Okay, I am going to end things there. I will see you guys next class. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Bye.